Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thanks so much for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm pleased to welcome Josh Shenk to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Josh will be discussing his book, Powers of Two. Two is the magic number because of the nature of creative thinking. Each partner pushes the other to greater heights than either could have reached alone. The most successful ones thrive on conflict and endure, while some pairs simply flame out. Josh Shenk is an essayist and author. His magazine pieces include cover stories in Harper's, Time, and The Atlantic, where his essay, What Makes Us Happy, was one of the most read articles in the history of the magazine's website. His first book, Lincoln's Melancholy, was named one of the best books of 2005 by several publications, including the New York Times. He is a curator, storyteller, and advisor to The Moth, and he has taught creative writing at the New School, New York University, and Washington College. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks to Microsoft for having me here today to talk about Powers of Two. This book started with a question: what is this thing we call chemistry or synergy or electricity? This quality between people that leaves us feeling sharper, smarter, funnier. In my case, feeling funny at all is an unusual thing, and it happens around particular people. I feel like I'm a different person in other people's presence, and I was curious to try to get to it. And I thought, if I looked at eminent partnerships, places, epic duos, whatever I was after existed in the space between these people. So I thought about Watson and Crick, who co-discovered DNA in just a few years at Cambridge. George Balanchine and his dancer Suzanne Farrell. Balanchine had many muses, but this was his last, and many consider his greatest. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who together laid the foundation for women's equality. They didn't live to see it, but they created the movement. And I began to continue with this list. I thought if I looked at many, many partners, I would get to the convergences, the common themes over and over again. But very quickly, I started to ask myself questions because I thought about Vincent van Gogh. Now, I knew that Theo van Gogh was a presence in his story. There is a book called Dear Theo, an autobiography of Vincent van Gogh. Most of what we know about Vincent comes in letters that he wrote to Theo. Theo is also often described as Vincent's supporter, as a common word used. And I thought, well, what is the story with that relationship? And I began to ask myself about other relationships. Martin Luther King, in his last speech, referred to Ralph Abernathy as my best friend in the whole world. And that was another question mark. Albert Einstein, when he was in the patent office, arranged for an engineer friend of his named Michel Besso to have a job there, and they would take long walks around lunchtime, and Einstein said it was as though the human contingencies did not exist on these walks. And so suddenly I began to see relational excitement operating in places where I thought there had been a lone genius. And I encountered that over and over again. And now suddenly this idea to look at chemistry, which I knew was exciting, but I thought was an outlying phenomenon. I thought it was this very unusual sort of peak experience phenomenon. It began to seem as though it is in one way or another, through many variations and manifestations, underneath the creative process constantly. And this really butts up against our conception of creativity, our conception of history, our conception of culture, which is very much a lone genius model. We read biographies, we look, on the cover of Fast Company, we see a single CEO profiled. We have this idea that creativity, especially these great epic things, arises from within an unusual figure. And one manifestation of this is actually eerily accurate is drunk history.
The War of 1812 happens. So when Britain, when they arrived on the shores, these British guys show up and they're like, awesome, like no one's here, so we'll just drop anchor and start trashing the place. While Dolly and James were in the White House, they get word that, holy shit, these guys have landed and they're heading this way. So James Madison's like, you know what, I'm gonna get on a horse and I'm gonna go there and I'm gonna be like, guess what? Knock, knock, president's here. And she's like, okay, see you for dinner. James leaves. She stays in the White House while everybody else in Washington is kind of being pussies and leaving. And she's like, holy shit. James just left on a horse and the shit's going down. Like, I can hear cannons going off. I can hear the shit happening. So Dolly was like, show Washington that I'm not leaving, everyone else can be pussies and they can leave. I've got my spyglass and I'm just gonna be checking the shit out. I'm gonna take care of everything until.
Okay. That is hilarious, but also very much the way that we tell stories about creative achievement or any kind of achievement. It's the drama of the single actor. You know, we think of the president riding off on his horse, and whether not we're stone cold sober or 3 or 4 drinks in, that is the way that we conceive history. And in fact, what I'm here to suggest, what I saw over and over again over 5 years of research, is that in one way or another, relational connection is underneath everything. And when we see that, we begin to see very many distinctions in relationships. And there are 3 fundamental types that I want to suggest. The first is the overt partnership. And this is what we think of when we think of collaboration. We think of Matt Stone and Trey Parker. We think of Lennon and McCartney. And yes, of course, 2 people who are in the same room, who are both associated with a common body of work. That is one place where this manifests. But there's also the phenomenon of the hidden partner. You have someone who's out front, who's very well known, and you have someone who is behind the scenes or off to the side, perhaps like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King, just barely off to the side. He was constantly there from the Montgomery bus boycott all the way to Memphis and the labor unrest that brought them there. They were staying in a motel room that was known as the King Abernathy Suite. So often had they stayed there alone. There's another picture of King and Abernathy. But of course, King's role in the partnership was to speak to the cameras. He was the philosopher king. They chose him for good reason to be the face of the movement. He had an elevated moral tone. He had a PhD, whereas Abernathy had a low sense of humor and was a canny strategist. And he was constantly at his partner's side. And yet, when the story is told, he is written out of it. And then there is Theo Van Gogh. This is what we think of and have thought of officially for many decades, a self-portrait by Vincent of Vincent. It is now thought to be by scholars a portrait of Theo Van Gogh, and that the emergence of Theo into image is a metaphor for the way that when you pay attention to Vincent van Gogh's story, you begin to see him not as an incidental supporter, but really as a co-creator of that body of work. And that's not me imposing a radical storyline. That's me essentially paraphrasing Vincent van Gogh, that his brother Theo was as responsible for the works attributed to him as he was. So we have overt partners and hidden partners, and then there are also distinct partners. There are places where 2 people who may be known separately from one another for distinct bodies of work are actually influencing each other and connecting with each other and competing with each other and critiquing each other and supporting one another. And this also is extremely common. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien never co-authored anything significant. Of course, we know Tolkien for The Lord of the Rings and Lewis for the Narnia books and many fine essays. But in fact, they co-created a form, this idea of the mythic parable soaked in Christian imagery at a time when it was ludicrous to their colleagues at Cambridge, and they got together, they began meeting once a week together over lunch, and then they assembled a group around them called the Inklings, and they met every week in this group, and they read their work aloud to one another. and critiqued it and responded to it and were competing with each other. And Tolkien said that for a very long time, Lewis was his only audience. You also see this with Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe, the same distinct partnership. And very often, the people that we are most entwined with and most connected with are somewhere out there. Maybe they work at another company, if you're in business. But what we're after is that sense of excitement and energy and heat that happens between people. There are also many different ways that these relationships are structured. They may be asymmetrical. One person may clearly work for the other or have a much smaller share of the enterprise. That's the case with Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett. Charlie Munger is not only the hidden partner, he's also very much the junior partner, and yet it is very clearly a partnership. Very often these relationships are also subtle. It's a matter of a feeling that's evoked more than any name that can be put on it. In fact, one of the characteristics of these partnerships is that it's very often hard to summarize what two people do for each other. And the partnerships may also be serial. There may be many partnerships. They may actually be parallel. There may be many partnerships simultaneously, as with me and my book editor, me and my literary agent, me and my research assistant. But there also may be serial major partnerships. And at Microsoft, there's a great illustration of this. The company created, there's a 13-year-old Bill Gates and I believe a 15-year-old Paul Allen. Another major partnership between Gates and Ballmer, and this ongoing partnership at the Gates Foundation between Bill and Melinda Gates. So now I had this, I was swimming in a sea of examples and hundreds of partnerships, and trying to look at, whenever possible, at the primary evidence, actually what people within the partnership said and did, or what was observed of them by people who were in the room with them or were in a position to know. And I was looking for the essential points, the things that happened over and over again. And I did find these 6 major stages that each were connected to a moment in the story. I tend to try to understand human experience through stories, because I think that that is a much truer way than the thin slice that we often see in popular social science. And it begins with this feeling of chemistry or electricity, this excitement, and it very often is immediate. And it also may have anything on a continuum of extremes in terms of the way it makes us feel. Sometimes electricity is like being a little toy car and you just don't have your battery, and someone puts a battery in and you're zooming across the floor. It very often feels that way to meet with someone and connect with them. Sometimes it feels like you're getting an electric shock. When Lewis and Tolkien first met, Lewis went home and wrote in his diary, "No harm in the fellow, only needs a smack or so." And there's also a famous story of Larry Page and Sergey Brin meeting and immediately breaking out into an argument. And someone said that they were like two swords sharpening each other. So electricity, it rouses us, it galvanizes us. It may not necessarily feel good. And while electricity can happen in a moment, what happens next is a much slower, longer, meandering process where two people who may excite each other as individuals slowly come to a kind of joint identity. You have two I's who move into a we. And that often actually is a literal phenomenon. People begin to speak in the first person plural, which is a good sign of this happening. Or you may veer back between the first person plural and the first person singular, which is an indication of, I don't know, is this our project? Is this my project? Is this your project? Once you begin to have that, to have that question on your mind, you're in the movement to joint identity. I use the metaphor in the book of confluence, when two rivers flow together, and sometimes one absorbs the other, and it takes the name of the larger river, as with the Ohio moving into the Mississippi. Sometimes two rivers come together, and it needs a new name for an entirely new phenomenon. And in fact, that is often the place where a partnership needs a name, when there is a sense of being bound up together, which may be existential, or it may be legal. And again, in the history of Microsoft, there's this moment when Gates and Allen moved to Albuquerque to begin writing BASIC, and all of a sudden they needed a partnership. They needed to negotiate credit, ownership, and they also needed a name at that moment. And they began bandying about, I think Allen and Gates was their first idea, and then suddenly this document appears, this legal agreement, that it's Paul Allen and Bill Gates doing business as Microsoft, and a discussion over who owned what, and this famous conversation where Gates insisted on 60% to Allen's 40%. That is a moment of being a we. The next stage is rules. Now people have met each other, they've excited each other, they're feeling this chemistry to begin with, and they've formed a joint unit. Within that joint unit, there are often very profound distinctions. Again, just as we think very narrowly about what electricity is, and we only think about collaboration, we tend to think only about two people in a room doing the same thing, more or less serving the same role, like Lennon and McCartney as songwriters. In fact, very often, one person's job is to be on stage, like Warren Buffett. He speaks to the world as the Oracle of Omaha, whereas Charlie Munger is off stage, and he is advising, and he is cajoling, and he is he is the man behind the scenes. And that is an example of a dynamic that recurs over and over again. We're familiar with the way that personality types that repeat over and over become archetypes of personalities. The same is true of relationships. There are certain relationship types that recur so often they are like archetypes, and the archetype of the on-stage person and the off-stage person I call the star and the director. And that is there is a literal truth to it, that one person is known and we can see them in the spotlight, and the other person is off stage. And there's also an undercurrent of the energy where the director is often the person who is calling the shots from off stage. And so with Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, you have Buffett's famous quip that Charlie does the talking, I just move my lips. The next stage surprised me the most, because I thought that once pairs were interlocked and intertwined, that was really the end of the story. But it turned out over and over again, pairs have to negotiate an optimal distance from one another. They need to have enough time together and enough time apart. The founders of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they came by this very naturally. One of them was a morning person, the other one was a night person, and they would meet every day for lunch. Sometimes it's much more extreme. You have writers who are in solitude for months at a time before they show anything, or may actually be in solitude permanently, like Emily Dickinson. And there's a long discussion of the case of Emily Dickinson in the book, because what we mistake as isolation and disengagement, I think actually needs to be reread as a very deliberate and quite canny and successful employment of distance. This is also a very live topic. Susan Cain, in her book Quiet, has really lit a fuse in a conversation about introverts and the particular needs of introverts in a culture that is emphasizing collaboration. Very often these two things are pitched against each other, but in fact, I see them as a kind of dance. In other words, the introvert, yes, needs time alone and needs time to breathe, maybe physically, maybe psychologically, maybe both, but also needs to have someone to whom he or she can bring that work, someone who at the end of this period of going into a cave, to come out into the sunlight and to connect. And that dialectic between solitude and connection turns out to be very fundamental, and also it's one of the reasons why the pair is a very special unit, because pairs can move so fluidly between solitude and connection. One reason that pairs need to get enough space from one another is that they need to rock back like a boxer getting ready to take a strike. And tension, power struggles, even outright conflict that can be very extreme is very fundamental to this story. Pairs begin with a great deal of rapport and alignment, and often shared values, and often a great deal of ease with one another. But there's always some profound difference. There's a different way of seeing the world, different way of working, a different body of knowledge, a different background. And when they come together, there's the cliche of peanut butter and chocolate. It just tastes better together, and that is often true in these partnerships. But the other cliche that applies is the oyster and the grain of sand, the sense of someone is irritating you because you're never quite on the same page. But very often that is what drives people to do their best work. And finally, we come to the end of the story, and there's the question of why do some pairs endure and why do others flame out? And of course, tension often brings people to a boiling point, and the only way out is to get out of the pot. This is the moment in the story where I really draw back the camera, because in my understanding of pairs who endure versus those who split up, the real distinction is not a change in the dynamic. Often the dynamic is present at the beginning. John Lennon and Paul McCartney are a great example. John was a swaggering, dominant presence, very associative and poetic. Paul was great with form and structure, and was also, though a very dominant type himself, was willing to be the number two, only to John Lennon, really only to John Lennon his whole life. And there was both an enormous amount of shared vision. They both had this ironic, comedic style, and they both loved the same music, and a radical difference in the way they saw the world. And there was a great deal of competition that was friendly and otherwise. And what happened towards the end of the Lennon-McCartney story is not that their dynamic changed, but that the world around them changed. They had been managed decently well by Brian Epstein. They had this very reliable third person, George Harrison, who was a kind of a constant sense of support to their songwriting nucleus. He helped bring the band into being. Brian Epstein died. George Harrison began to buck his role, and also now this world in which these two men, Lennon and McCartney, had been primary to each other and really the only people in each other's lives, in a very basic way, began to shift as they were in their late 20s and began to think seriously about forming serious partnerships with women. I want to turn to conversation with you, and I want to leave you with a couple of core points from the book. Myths of interconnection. One very fundamental point is that we tend to have this oppositional idea, and it's natural to the human mind. We understand things by pitting things against each other. So we think of the mind versus the body. Of course, if we reflect on it a little bit, we know that the mind and the body are interconnected, and it's the same is true with solitude and connection. The question is not whether we do our great work alone or whether we do our great work with other people, but how we move back and forth between these things. And finally, competition and cooperation. This idea of going up against someone, challenging them, being critical, is not necessarily at odds with trying to advance a common interest. And very often, in fact, it's the people who have the courage to step to each other and push each other the hardest who are able to do the best work with each other. I want to say just a little bit about how the dyad is relevant in the context of teams, because I know that is the sort of the root unit of many corporate cultures and a root unit of cultures at Microsoft. Even when groups are at play, dyads are often essential. The pair is the primary creative unit, and I say that just based on sociological research into creativity that finds that critical advances, even in the context of groups, often happens within a pair. In the Impressionists, this was the case. In Monty Python, obviously a group ethos was created, but they would pair off to do their writing. In a writer's room like Mad Men, you have kind of collaborative, give and take with 8 or 10 people around a big table, but then scripts are assigned to individual writers who will work with the head writer. So very often the dyad can function well within a team, but also there can be dyads that happen between groups of people. So you may have a leader in relationship to the group, and many of the principles of dyads can apply there too. And that brings us back to the critical dynamics that show up over and over again in the book. There is this dynamic between the liquid in the container, the person who is pushing out and trying to dream of something new, and the person who is paying attention to form and practicality. That may happen between two people. It may also happen between two factions, and it's worth noticing and paying attention to it because it can be extremely generative. And finally, the main thing, people often ask me, can I boil this down to a single lesson? And the word that recurs to me is humility, because to be pushed by someone, to be drawn out of our skin, to be drawn out of a place where we're comfortable, to be drawn into a place where we're actually not even sure where the boundaries of our individual self end and our relationship to someone else begins, is inherently uncomfortable, and it can be the source of enormous excitement and growth, but it also can be the source of enormous vexation and difficulty. And to have a humble attitude towards it will allow us to cultivate it and bring more of it into our lives. With that, I want to thank you very much for coming. I'm eager to stay in touch with any of you who'd like to be, who have more questions, and of course I'm glad to take your questions now. Yes, sir.
So I just want to continue on your thought about how the idea kind of applies in organizational setups.
Yes.
While in most organizations we do have different team setups, the predominant one is about assigning one person to go lead the charge.
Yes.
And own discrete things across the teams. Each person owns a thing. We rarely think about two in the box, go solve ideas.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, should organizations evolve to kind of, apply this idea more discreetly in how they assign and staff?
Yes. So what's an example of, off the top of your head, of a discrete task that someone will be sent off to do on their own?
Let's say there's a marketing team, and it's usually made up of 5 individuals. Everybody has different strengths, but the way work's allocated is every challenge, 5 challenges are assigned to each one, versus, let's say, teaming up 2 to go take on a
Yes.
challenge.
Yes. Well, certainly the assignment to go off on one's own and return to the group can be fruitful and generative. There's a reason why that shows up over and over again. To some extent, I would think about, is the nature of the work and the person who is going off to do that work best suited for an individual in solitude, or is it best suited for a team? Because very often a team of 2 kind of going off in a pod from the mother ship is a more effective unit. For the purposes of songwriting in the Beatles, for the purposes of comedy writing in Monty Python, they would get together, John and Paul and the Monty Python guys, these 2 teams, and do all the things that are 2 people are very well suited to do. Hash out ideas and long periods of silence, and also going off from within that pair and spending time alone and then bringing it back to the other. And I would say, it's worth looking at least, because we are not in a position to properly evaluate what pairs have accomplished in history, because so much of the DNA of pairs is effacing one member of it, because so often one member of a pair is a hidden partner, is off in some corner of history, and the dots don't get connected. I mean, Gandhi is this, a towering lone genius figure. We think of him, alone on his cane, sort of standing up to the British Empire. Gandhi had a partner who was his ghostwriter, his chief of staff, his constant companion. He kept his diary. There were texts that this man, Mahadev Desai, wrote that Gandhi would make a single change to. He would cross out Desai's initials at the end and write his own initials. And that is one of the few things we know, and it's very telling because this man's whole presence in the story was erased. And you could read, a great scholarly biography of Gandhi and learn very, very little about this man. I alluded earlier to the relationship between Einstein and Michel Besso. Besso is entirely, he has virtually no presence in the Einstein story. And I'm not here actually in that case to tell you a story that has been lost because it's irrecoverable. And there are many, many other places, and this was in the book, where you can restore these relationships and you can now evaluate work that we had previously thought as the province of a lone individual, as the product of a partnership. And so if we don't think of two as a potent unit, it may be because it actually doesn't, in that instance, it's not the best unit, but it very well may be that we simply have not appreciated the power of two. Yes, sir.
Through your research and the sort of thinking that you've done about it, have you observed any differences in the dynamic between partnerships where it's two men versus two women versus a man and a woman?
Sure.
Together.
Well, there's so many. There's so many variations. I mean, they're gender variations. They're some partners are brothers, like the Coen brothers. Some are married. Some are not married but sleeping together. People, they're fathers and sons. There are people who actually dislike each other. There's a whole discussion in the book of adversarial collaboration. Two people actually trying to beat each other, and yet in that heat, in that energy, bring out the best in one another, and really do become partners. The story that I tell to lead that section is Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. They were literally trying to defeat the other and crush the other, and took pleasure in each other's suffering. And all the while, they really made each other, and they did together save the NBA. Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse are a similar story, and the relationship between Microsoft and Apple over time is a story of co-opetition, competition and cooperation that are conjoined. And I do have digressions where I pay attention to these distinctions, but I'm constantly trying to channel things back into these common themes. And so whether you have two women or two men, or there's an erotic charge, of course these are worth paying attention to and are interesting, and yet it was really remarkable to me how often these same basic themes emerge over and over again. And I will leave many of these sort of subset discussions to people who I hope will follow on and continue this. I mean, how much of this is a Western phenomenon versus an Eastern phenomenon is very interesting. But if you look at the co-founders of Sony, and you look at Gates and Allen, it's amazing how much the stories of people when they first meet. There are these basic things that happen over and over again that we can begin to recognize and integrate into our own lives as we think about partnerships. And you look at the roles people take on and on, the recurrences were staggering. Yes?
In your research, were you able to notice any sort of recurring themes on how these pairs were able to find each other?
Yes. It's so simple. It's almost ridiculously simple, but it's, people tend to meet through similarities, and they tend to meet because someone introduces them, and they're usually that introducer usually has the point of similarity in mind. So the Curies first met because Marie, was not then Marie Curie, Marie Sklodowska, I believe, needed a lab space. And someone said, oh, well, I know the scientist Pierre Curie, and perhaps he could be helpful to you, and they were introduced. That is an extremely common story. Buffett and Munger, Buffett went to pitch this doctor in Omaha, and the guy was quite taken with him and invested in him, and it was a big deal, and Buffett was a little bit taken aback that the guy was so willing to take such a big risk on a very young investor, and he said, "You remind me of Charlie Munger, and that's why I'm going to invest in you." And then that family set those two guys up to meet. So introductions, and then the other term that shows up over and over again is magnet places. People who are drawn by their similar interests to a shared space. John and Paul were both drawn into the music world, and Paul came out to hear this band, the Quarrymen that John Lennon was in, and they began to excite each other. Schools, companies, places where you go because you want to do something very specific. That's where it happens, and very often it's worth thinking about that as the foundation. It is literally the foundation for many pairs, but then on top of that commonality, that's where the sense of difference and opposition comes into play. So you want to go, to turn this into a self-help point, you want to think about the people that you have a profound amount of commonality with, but then on top of that sense of almost being like identical twins, you want to look for the person who is so strange, it's like they're a member of a different species. And the person who, on top of that feeling of great rapport and alignment, the person who really pushes you and maybe even shocks you with the way they come from a totally different place. Yes, Amy.
I've got a question from online. He says, I'm interested in your thoughts about novelist co-authors. For example, Michael Doris and Louise Erdrich claimed that they each left their work open for the other to co-write, which I think would cause total insanity.
Yes, so that is a really interesting example of two writers who, in a way, co-wrote all their work, although they also fell into very distinct roles. One would bring an idea to the other, and they would hash it out, and then the other would go off and write an outline or write a draft, and then it became Doris's book, in quotes, or Erdrich's work, and they were not actually co-writing a lot of the time in the technical sense of having both their names on the book. And so even within this place of immense fluidity, they did fall into roles, and that is how the kind of, what would strike the asker of the question is a kind of madness and a kind of chaos. It resolves into some kind of form by the things that people do repeatedly and the patterns that they fall into. And writers, I'm very interested in this because I am a writer, and you say, and people think it's quite odd, and they often say, well, didn't you, isn't it strange that you wrote this book alone? And I think people often think it's a little bit hypocritical. And I say, well, my name is the only name on the cover. I am the author. That is my role. I'm here to talk to you. I did sit in front of a computer screen for many years, but I had an editor who was the co-creator of the book who was fulfilling his role, who is now somewhere in his office in New York City, attending to other books, and also attending to aspects of production and marketing and distribution, who responded to my text, and who was when I would initiate and he would critique. So very often, and this is also a classic case of a hidden partner, and also a star and a director. I'm the star in the sense that I am associated with this body of work. He is the director in the sense that he actually is a lot of times telling me what to do. And then I am shouting back at him, and we're getting into the tension stage. Yes?
Is there stuff you can do to strengthen one of these partnerships?
Definitely. That is often my experience of in my own life and also talking to people is that there's a kind of awakening in contact with this material to how important and valuable this stuff is, to what it can do for us, and also to the way that it's operating in our lives, often in ways that we haven't fully articulated to ourselves or recognized. And I think of the book as a kind of frame around experience. It often gives a language and vocabulary for things that we are already experiencing, but may not have fully recognized. And along with naming things, there is a sense of, I think, often implicit instruction. So the tricky thing is that instruction is a kind of a series of paired opposites. So I wouldn't tell you, not knowing anything about the partnerships operating in your life, that you need to enhance your role distinctions. It may be that you're in a partnership where you've gotten a little rigid in your roles and you're not in enough play, and one guy is the marketing guy and the other guy is the engineer, and you're holding on to those identities a little bit too tightly. If that's the case, then two people paying attention to the rule is clarity and fluidity. And so if you find yourself a little rigid, you may need more fluidity. If you find yourself overly fluid, like, man, we're here and we're doing this thing together, but I don't know what you're doing, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what my identity is in this, or what your identity, I don't even know, how we can be accountable to each other because it's all so vague. Well, then maybe you need to define roles. And that is very often, a strengthening moment for relationships. The same with tension and conflict. A lot of times people have just gone way too far. They're at each other's throats. It's miserable, and they don't want to, be in each other's lives. And a lot of times people will break up at that moment when, in fact, there is an enormous amount to learn from the tension that emerges. And stepping back can be very helpful and saying, okay, well, why am I so threatened by this? The opposite point may be true too, that you are too polite, that you're, don't want to hurt someone's feelings, you don't want things to be unpleasant. And then I think it's worth paying attention to the history of innovation, including the history of this company. And there's a lot of unpleasantness. There's a lot of pushing and a lot of shouting. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily, that's not the only style that works. And you do have people who work together all the time, and they're really, they don't report much overt conflict. But it's also true that overt conflict shows up over and over again, and sometimes needs to be engaged. I had a great deal of overt conflict with my editor towards the end, and I talk about it in the epilogue of the book. And the irony is that he revealed to me only a couple weeks ago when we did an event together. I quote this email he sent me, which is one of the most brutal communications I've ever gotten, telling me, I had to finish the book or else, and eviscerating my performance up to that moment. And he told me that he was actually inspired by the material of the book to send that email, that he was having these thoughts. And he was furious at me, and he really thought I did not get the way that being slow on the book was affecting him, affecting his colleagues, affecting all his other authors. And he sat down and he wrote this. He got into his, the highest dudgeon he could get into, and he wrote me this note. And that is often helpful too. There's a kind of honesty and a kind of respect in and bringing your toughest stuff to your partner. Yes?
Did you see any patterns where the more productive a partnership was, or powerful, to use your title, the sharper the relief when it ended, when partnerships ended?
When you say relief, how do you mean?
When those partnerships ended, were they more abrupt or sharper? Was there any pattern between that and how productive they were, or not necessarily?
Certainly it's true that, from great heights there are great falls. From great alignment there is great enmity within partnerships and afterwards. And, the story that runs through the book, I return to over and over again because it illustrates the theme so perfectly, and because I just love the music, is the Beatles and Lennon and McCartney. And it's, it's mythic, the breakup between them, and we all feel like we know it, and yet the story is much deeper and more gnarled in that, as I pointed out, the the real drama had not to do so much with the dynamic between them as the way that that dynamic became exacerbated by the changing conditions in their lives. But then the next piece of the story is to say, well, then what actually happened? And I have a chapter towards the end where I say, why did Lennon and McCartney split? And then the next chapter is, did Lennon and McCartney split? And the argument of the chapter is that in the sense of ceasing work together, yes, there is a moment when they were in the studio together for the last time, and they had their last writing sessions and whatnot. You could say their relationship was no longer, functioning as a creative relationship after that. But in the sense of being disengaged from one another, being uninterested in one another, losing that sense of competitive spark with one another, losing a desire to create with one another again, that never ended. And in fact, John and Paul, they ceased work together in the late 60s, but and there was a great deal of nastiness in the early 70s, but as early as 1972, 1973, there's a real interest in them working together again, and for a variety of reasons it never happened. But John Lennon in 1980 began talking openly to the people he was closest with about going back into the studio with Paul and writing songs together with him and hoping that George would come along, because at that point George was the holdout. And this was shortly before Lennon's assassination. So had Lennon lived, we might tell that story in a very different way. I'm not sure I'm totally getting to your question, but I think...
No, just I think about like probably one of the most productive partnerships I had in a work environment where we produced a lot of really good quality things and really kind of went through that fire together.
Yeah.
Once that ended, like I haven't spoken to that person in years.
I see, yeah. Well,
and so I was wondering if you've seen if that's unusual or if you've seen other examples.
I see.
And I think it's because some of it we went through like these battles, and then it was over, and it was so much that was like that was.
Yeah, no, that resonates with what I've seen, and it, I think it draws on an essential point, which is how do you characterize a sublime, or even a high functioning, or even a very good creative relationship, and what are the criteria? And in some ways it resonates with friendships and with romantic relationships even. It brings out our best and so forth. But there is a sharp distinction, because romantic relationships and friendships, the real test is how does it feel, and do you enjoy it? Whereas the test of creative work is what is the quality of the work? And whether you love each other or really dislike each other or anything in between, if the work is great, then the relationship is high functioning. And it is often the case that people, it's hard to be in that space, and people do need a release from it. And it can be, once you're out, it's hard to be in any kind of middle ground, because it wasn't a middle ground to begin with. And a lot of times these tensions last years and years. I was just rewatching the 60 Minutes interview that that Alan did when his book came out, The Idea Man, and it's it has these very kind of harsh things to say, and is reporting a harsh reality of his partnership with Gates. And she says, "Well, have you talked to him about it?" "No, we haven't talked about it." "Do you think you will?" I think we will, and I think it's going to, I think it'll probably be pretty heated. And I kind of thought, watching that, maybe they won't. Sometimes when you are in one of these, very heated partnerships, it's not the kind of thing you can go to couples therapy for. It's not the kind of thing that you sit down over a coffee and kind of hash out in a friendly way. Sometimes it's too intense. Yes, ma'am.
So the power of two, do you think it would work for like 3 people or like?
Thanks for that question, because it really is essential. I began with this project thinking about chemistry, and so that naturally drew me into thinking about 2 people, because it was just a natural unit. But as I began to see relationships underneath so much creativity and innovation, that raised the question, well, what is unusual about a pair? And that became an important part of the project to draw that out, because there is this repeated sense, this repeated finding that an unusual amount of creativity does happen in a pair. Very often companies will have a team of founders, but you can zero in on the nucleus, which comes down to a pair. A lot of times a threesome will jettison a member of that founding team. A lot of times when there's apparently a threesome or a foursome, it takes a little digging, but you can find that nucleus within. And there are certain reasons why the pair is an unusual unit. It is the smallest possible social unit. So you can create a whole world with another person that you can't quite do in your mind. As a small child locked in a gaze with a caregiver, that becomes your reality. Thinking is literally a download of external exchanges between a child and an adult. And at a certain point, I mean, this is obviously a simplistic metaphor, but it does represent psychological thinking now, that more or less becomes downloaded into the mind, and those exchanges become what we call thinking. The pair is also a unit where people can be playing roles and then can switch roles. So one person can be initiating, can be dreaming, can be brainstorming, and the other can be responding, critiquing, and then they can flip. If you add a third person to that dynamic, what you get, the benefit is structure and stability. People are going to tend to fall into roles that recur over and over again, and that can be extremely valuable, especially if you're trying to build something that endures, but it becomes less flexible, it becomes more rigid. And this dance between solitude and connection, which is so fundamental to creativity, is harder in a group. If you think about a room with 3 people in it and you leave, you have left the group. It may be something so very simple. You've just gone to lunch and they're continuing on. You have made a choice. That group exists and you are out of it. If you are working with one person and you break, now you have 2 people who are in solitude, and that is just. I mean, it's in some ways very very subtle whether you add a third person or a fourth person, but it's actually quite profound, and that's the reason why you see people returning to dyads over and over again. It's the reason why John and Paul, who were very much in a trio with George, and actually at one point, the name of the Beatles was Japage, the first few letters of their names. And they thought, when they really got going, should we include George as part of the songwriting team? And I don't know, if they were applying any principles of pair dynamics to the decision, but it's telling that they decided against it. And they maintained that they maintained the dyad as the core unit. And John said, "Paul and me were the Beatles." You see that over and over again. And it's not been attended to. I'll just say very briefly, you have a lot of discussion of creativity as the province of the lone genius. You have a lot of discussion of teams and networks and cultures. There's a massive business literature on this. You have very, very little material on the pair. And it's hugely underattended to. And it's underattended to in part because it takes us into things that are inherently complex and inherently dialectical, which is just a fancy word for talking about the way 2 things come together and form a third. But it calls on us to work with contradiction and paradox and ambiguity, which is often, uncomfortable for people who are trying to systematize and rationalize something, and a lot of the business literature is trying to do that. Apply some kind of framework that you can use over and over again. And relationships are not. They're more subtle and delicate. There are certain principles that apply, but you have to be living it and be present in it in order to do your best within it. Yes.
I wonder, have you touched on, or did you discover in your research any parallels between sort of theory of the bicameral mind and the sort of talking to yourself, or
Yes.
the voice in your head versus the exterior voice of a partner?
Yes. Yes, this is one of my favorite pieces of discovery, and that when we look at creative thinking, because of course an enormous amount does happen when you're walking on the beach or when you're, swimming or walking. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is this great psychologist, the creator of the idea of flow, and wrote a seminal book on creativity. Gave pagers to lots of creative people and pinged them and had them report what they were doing at the random moment that he had pinged them, and it turned out that walking and I believe swimming was second, and so this sense of kind of being in a rhythm, often being in solitude, the sort of the beach stroll is the iconic indicator of that. And we all have this experience, and it's extremely common. And then the question becomes, what's actually happening in that space? What's happening to Paul Simon when he writes a song? What's happening to Rilke when he, has a poem almost appear to him as an external entity? And what you see over and over again is, again, a dialogical phenomenon. You see a dyad happening, and the dyad here is, inside the creative mind, is a sense of a receiving presence and a sense of a generating presence. And if you pay attention, people really struggle with how to describe this. They may talk about the unconscious, they may talk about a muse, usually these days metaphorically, but they're trying to represent this sense of an internal conversation. And you can contrast that to these two extremes. One is the extreme of kind of being frozen, and there's just kind of white noise in your head. And the other is the experience of many, many voices. Well, you could try this, but what about this, or how about this? That neither tends to be creative. The creative moments is when an idea presents itself, and it somehow you are regarding it as though on a screen, or hearing it as though a voice is speaking it into your ear. And I know as a writer, those are the finest sentences that appear in that way, and that has a great deal in common with the kinds of dynamics that are embodied in pairs. And so, the pair is not just it doesn't just actualize creativity. It also becomes a model with which we can think about things both inside our head and within teams and within organizations and even within cultures. You can think about the ways that the dialogue happen to further creativity or to disrupt it. Yes?
There's a fair amount of work around pair programming, and how two programmers work together and their body of code gets to a piece of quality faster than two individual programmers.
Yes.
Do you think that there's organizations in human resources where they're actually thinking about saying, when I set up my goals this year, I'm going to set them up, and I can choose to work on my own, or I can choose to team up with somebody, and my goals we're a pair, and our goals are tied together. Are there companies that are thinking about those kinds of things?
The pair is still largely neglected and largely obscured. That example of paired programmers I have heard of, but it's presented as a kind of oddity. I mean, the root unit in most corporate cultures is the team still, and when people are called on in cultures to deal with interpersonal dynamics, it often feels extremely exotic. I know someone who is a high-level consultant who works with CEOs and COOs at a moment of breakdown, for instance, and she comes in and begins to apply certain basic principles, and she says people are always very uncomfortable, and they always make the joke, is this like couples therapy at work? It just seems really out of place. And because so many things arise. I mean, we tend to think we ought to separate our feelings as people and our pettinesses and our jealousies and our desires, that are not work related from whatever we're doing at work. But in fact, it's extremely porous, especially when we're doing creative work that where we need to bring our whole soul to what's in front of us, and especially when we get into conflict. There's a cliche that when you're in conflict, separate, make these very neat distinctions, between what's relevant and what's not. But the very physiology of conflict is going to break down those barriers and what these psychologists call hot topics. That you're going to be least able to do that in these moments of high tension, and so in order to think about how pairs function well together, we need to have conversations about emotions, and we need to have conversations about dynamics that are not strictly rational. But I do think that there is a future for this, and that's a lot of my work, is to represent these stories. And it's pretty intense, the feedback I'm getting. I met with a guy who I won't name. It wasn't on the record, but he is the second guy in a piece of culture that is known all over the world, a major piece in the culture, and he is the hidden partner, very well respected and acknowledged, of course, in his field, very well treated and very happy in his work. But he told me, I always thought that collaborating was the easy way out. I knew I was good at it. I knew I'd do my best, in concert, but I always had a sense that one day maybe I would do something on my own, and if I did, then I would really have, done something creative, and if I didn't, well, then, it's okay what I've done. And he was really thunderstruck by this material, and at one point we had lunch together, and he raised his hand, and he said, "I'm not ashamed anymore." And he began to think, well, maybe doing something on his own would not be going off, into a cave somewhere. Maybe it would be identifying another partnership where he was a senior partner, and he could be calling the shots and actually enacting much of the same dynamics that he enacts in his present role. That's happening a lot. People who are actually running a business together are coming up to me with sort of their eyes, wide open, and saying they never thought about. Of course, they knew that they're the CEO and the other person the COO or whatever. They understand these mechanics, but they've never thought about this as a relationship in this mythic way, and never thought about it as something that deserves a great deal of attention and respect and thinking, and where there's certain things that happen over and over again, that you may, when you're in the midst of it, say, well, this just sucks. A friend of mine who runs a business has a guy who is his trusted deputy, who he has done great work with, but has always been the number two to my friend who's always been the number one. And this number two guy is like, I got to do something on my own. I got to be the lead guy. And it's kind of tragic because neither one can do as well without the other. And when you're in the midst of this, you may think you're all alone. In fact, that is an extremely common dynamic. It doesn't fix it to know that it's common, but it at least allows you to get some perspective and distance that say, okay, we're playing this. We're playing out something that has happened from the beginning of time, and we're, if we're encountering problems, it's not a sign of a partnership being problematic. Very often encountering problems is a sign that you are doing the work of partnership, and that's the moment to dig in and to carry on with whatever with whatever the work at hand is. Okay.
Any thoughts on people coming together voluntarily versus in an organization setting?
Yes.
Pair programming, for example, it might be mandated.
Right.
I worked for some company where it was mandated to pair program.
Yes. right, the arranged marriage versus the versus the romantic model of love. I do think that the chemistry, which is where this begins, is it's animal, and we don't fully understand it. Why people arouse us and why we feel a certain level of comfort. I have identified certain patterns in the book, and there's certain sort of discrete lessons to draw, things that happen repeatedly. But on some level, it's ineffable. And my best understanding of how to have more of it in my life is to come into an awareness of it. I mean, I find the way that I speak, the way that I think, shifts sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, according to who I'm in relationship with. And when I am my best self and when I'm most fluid, it's often on a needle. Sort of the needle points here towards empty. I'm just dead inside. I simply cannot communicate with this person. Or at the opposite extreme is, I'm like a Lamborghini with this person, and very often it's in the middle, and learning to pay attention to that I think is extremely important, and really does tend against a kind of arranged marriage model, although does not necessarily mean you can't do a kind of speed dating model where you create an environment where people get to have lots of little experiences with one another, and you see how good is the work, what's it like for them to be within it. I think actually just throwing people together, because something makes sense on paper, it may be a decent place to start, but if you're not paying attention to their internal experience and the actual output, and you think that the paper qualifications are enough to make that match, I think is really problematic, because it just negates, it negates agency and idiosyncrasy and passion and desire and all these things that may not be hugely valued by organizational managers, but as creative people, we know that's the soul of the machine. Thank you.